or tired
No.
of being in the Cosby bubble. You know what I mean?
That sentence was like a needle piercing through a glossy layer of memory. It was an episode of The Cosby Show that Malcolm-Jamal Warner, the young man who played Theo since he was 14, had never wanted to watch again. Not because he acted poorly, but because it reminded him of a moment that was folded away, when Theo dared to cross the line of being the good son, confronted the perfect father, and then everything was retuned, smoothed over, and vanished from the airwaves. Years later, Warner chose silence, stepped away from the noise. But the memory of that episode he didn't want to revisit lingered like a shadow. The kind of memory that forces one to ask who pressed delete and why. If that episode had remained untouched, would Theo and Warner have been seen differently? Are you ready to unspool that tape with us? The unforgettable cut from The Cosby Show. To understand why such a brief cut became a thorn in Warner's memory, one that made him never want to watch it again, we have to return to the dazzling orbit of The Cosby Show. Airing from 1984 to 1992, this family sitcom didn't just change the face of American primetime television. It consistently topped the ratings, at one point holding the #1 spot year after year. In that landscape, Warner, once a basketball-loving, earnest-speaking boy, became a teen icon on screen. By age 16, he was receiving major award nominations. Audiences, meanwhile, had memorized Theo's slightly goofy but lovable persona. Struggling in school, awkward in love, always ending up being taught a heartfelt lesson by his father, sealed with a hug. That model was so smooth it became a recipe for success. Cliff spoke, Theo listened. The adults paved the way, the child matured. Viewers laughed, then nodded in agreement. The scene that was cut came just as that formula was about to go out of phase. In a draft from the mid-1980s near season 3, when Warner had become more confident on set and Theo was just mature enough to no longer want to play the obedient child, the son didn't just argue back. He directly questioned something every family has but rarely voices aloud. Is discipline truly fair? Or is it sometimes just a cloak of power tailored only for those who wield it? Why must children obey unconditionally, while fathers are rarely called out for being wrong? This wasn't sitcom material anymore. It was tenser, sharper, placing the father long portrayed as the family's moral anchor into a trial by fire. In the script reading room, those lines thickened the air. For Warner, it was a moment he realized Theo might not just be a clumsy kid trying to grow up, but a young person truly searching for his voice. But The Cosby Show wasn't just Theo's story. It was a meticulously crafted universe built around the image of the ideal father, Dr. Cliff Huxtable, humorous, wise, morally upright, like a cornerstone of the house. That figure didn't just draw viewers every Thursday night. It also carried a cultural mission to portray a successful, stable, happy black family, countering a host of negative stereotypes in real life. When a character is the pillar of such a message, every crack is examined under a microscope. That's why a confrontation that might make Cliff look wrong even for a few minutes was enough to make the show's core creators pause and ask, should this scene be greenlit at all? What followed was a very professional process. The editing team returned to the table, softened the sharper edges of the dialogue, cooled the heat of the conflict, and realigned the pacing to fit the familiar tone that had earned the show its rating miracle. If the original version was like a sharp turn, the edited one was a gentle curve. Cliff remained the wise gateway to understanding. Theo returned to being the son who learned a new lesson. The conflict wasn't entirely erased, but the boundary was pushed back just enough so it no longer threatened the brand's polished surface. And when the episode aired, the audience never knew another version had existed, one where the son didn't lower his voice at the right moment, letting the question go all the way to the end. Placed in the broader context of a super successful machine, it's clear why that scene felt off-tone. When you're the show that can top the charts for multiple seasons, even a single off-key note sounds louder than usual. When the actor playing the father is also the final script approver. Preserving the brand's trajectory is not just an artistic choice, but an operating principle. The show's writers, who had to generate 20-25 new stories each season, learned how to craft heartwarming lessons instead of shock triggers. Learned how to let characters grow through understanding, not power clashes. That formula helped The Cosby Show reach millions of families and made them feel safe. But it was also that very formula that made bold experiments like the confrontation between Theo and Cliff almost impossible to bring into the spotlight. Bill Cosby's decision to censor. That decision landed as quietly as a fingertip, pressing pause in the editing room. No arguments, no lengthy memos, just a few brief words about tone scribbled on the edge of the script, and everyone knew what was coming. On The Cosby Show, Bill Cosby wasn't just the lead actor, he was the heartbeat of the entire machine. The one who set the pitch for every line, dictated how long a glance should linger, and most importantly, where the invisible boundary lay between what could be spoken and what must remain behind the curtain. When the confrontation scene between Theo and Cliff touched that boundary, it immediately became a test of the creative control Cosby had carefully constructed over many seasons. Picture a typical workday. During the show's golden years, the writers submitted drafts in the morning. The whole cast read through scripts in the afternoon, and any major revisions, if needed, were issued before the studio locked up, so the typing team could print updated colored pages for the entire crew by next morning. For a network series producing around 20 episodes per season, the production pace was relentless, demanding decisions that were both swift and consistent. And on The Cosby Show, that consistency revolved around a single axis. Cliff Huxtable had to be the kind of father who was warm, wise, and steady like the beam that held the whole house up. The father could be funny, even occasionally flustered by his kids, but never shown as a failure in matters of basic morality. That was the identity audiences fell in love with, the reason families gathered around the TV each night, and the shield that protected the brand across 8 seasons and 201 episodes. In that context, Theo's confrontation scene was like an off note in a familiar melody. It didn't ruin the song, but it pulled the listener's ear in another direction, to a place where Cliff was no longer the unconditional beacon of wisdom, and the son who had long learned to grow by listening now demanded the right to ask his question to the very end. For Warner, reading that scene felt like stepping out the front door and realizing he'd grown half a head taller. It wasn't just another lesson for Theo, it was a moment where the character took back agency. But to Cosby, it represented a dangerous shift. Not dangerous because of a father-son argument. The Cosby Show was full of small conflicts that ended with hugs. The danger lay in the domino effect. If Cliff could be questioned about fundamental fairness, the milestone of the perfect father, the cornerstone of the Huxtable universe would begin to crack. And a small crack in the writer's room could show up as a visible wrinkle on screen. The censorship decision, therefore, was executed like a tone adjustment swap. A few verbs reshape a question, turn a peak into a valley, and lower the degree of confrontation to something more like discussion. The script wasn't scrapped, it was smoothed, polished, made to sound like The Cosby Show, meaning it still ended with a lesson where Cliff guided, and Theo realized something about responsibility, love, and respect. Even the blocking might have stayed the same, wide shots in the living room, kids moving up and down the stairs like syncopated beats, warm lighting. But the sharp edge of the story, the question about the double standard of discipline, was dulled just enough, so Cliff was never seen on the defensive. The result, the episode flowed smoothly, fitting right into the chain of successes already measured in ratings, ad deals, and the label safe for the whole family, beloved by both networks and sponsors. The key point is, at that time, censorship didn't appear like a pair of scissors. Cutting harshly, it functioned more like a compass. Cosby knew exactly why America loved the Huxtables. They embodied a wholesome dream, a middle-class intellectual black family united upright and conquering prejudice through warmth and humor. For that dream to stand firm, the central character had to remain the central pillar, meaning any direct blow to his integrity was almost never allowed to air. Not because viewers were fragile, but because The Cosby Show willingly took on the role of safe haven in an era of TV riddled with darker tones. The censorship decision thus didn't just protect an episode, it protected an unspoken pact with tens of millions of families. When you visit the Huxtables, you'll leave with a smile and a heartwarming lesson, not an uneasy feeling about the father you just laughed with. Within that power structure, Warner's role was both advantageous and ironic. Advantageous because he had a stable track to develop on, growing a little each season, learning a bit more each episode, guided by an on-screen father from small missteps to maturity. Ironic because every time he as an actor tried to let Theo step outside the frame, The script would pull the character back into orbit. Warner understood this operating principle earlier than most. He knew when a line should be delivered, and when it should be held back, when Theo's eyes could reach the edge of challenge, and when they had to return to the rhythm that reassured America. That professionalism helped him grow in the industry, but it also left a penciled-in mark in his memory. Some scenes are too real to fit the tone. Cosby's decision to censor from a production standpoint was also a risk management strategy. A big network series at the time thrived on consistency scripts, flowing schedules, tight post-production on time. A disruptive scene could throw the entire machine out of sync, odd timing audience laughter landing off cue, or worse, igniting a public debate beyond control, pulling the show away from the image it had cemented in viewers' minds. In the end, Cosby chose the safer route, preserve the tone, the rhythm, the promise to the audience. And on that straight path, Theo's confrontation, however beautiful, however full of potential, was filed away in the someday drawer. In hindsight, it's tempting to ask, what if? What if that scene had aired? Would Theo have changed course completely? Would Warner have crossed a new threshold in his acting? Would Cliff perhaps have become more human because of it? But what if is not something a clockwork television machine can afford to entertain? For Cosby, tonal and character consistency wasn't just artistic taste, it was the survival strategy of a brand that had entered every living room. He did what any conductor must do when a brilliant musician plays a little off-score signal, a return to tempo, because the audience didn't come for improvisation. And that's why the censorship decision that day, seemingly simple, but in truth, very complex, became a small knot in the grand story of The Cosby Show, how to keep a cultural icon intact through long seasons, without cracking under moments that felt a little too real. For Warner, that knot became a memory. He didn't want to revisit a moment he saw Theo break out of the mold, only to witness that mold being gently, silently put back in place. For the audience, the decision left no direct trace. The episode stayed smooth. The lesson stayed warm. But for those who were there, that was the day. The Cosby Show's tone won another battle, while a powerful scene quietly slipped into the shadows, lingering echoes and long-term impact. What remained after that tone adjustment wasn't just a smoother episode, it was an undercurrent that stretched across decades. For Malcolm-Jamal Warner, the imprint became clear in the way he told his story as an actor. Every so often across interviews years apart, he would drop a passing remark that some scenes were too real to ever be seen. Not because the writers lacked skill, nor because the actors were inexperienced, simply because a tonal hand had drawn a very clear boundary around what belonged inside the frame. The way Warner spoke gently without accusation or self-congratulation only made the message more resonant. This wasn't a surface scratch, it was structural. A young actor had to learn the aesthetic map of the show, the way one learns the unwritten rules of a city where you're allowed to turn and where you're not. Backstage whispers spread like a layer of stage dust. The original version of the confrontation had existed, had been read, had silenced the room, and then vanished completely from the archives, leaving only the polished version for broadcast. No footnotes, no listings in the tape catalog. The silence wasn't clumsy concealment. It was a skill erasing a crease without leaving a wrinkle. And it was that cold professionalism that caused the scene to slip out of the system's memory, instantly surviving only in human recollection. Those who were there would remember. The storage logs would not. Then real life came crashing into the script, allegations emerged, and decisions were swiftly executed in industry-standard language. Adjust the broadcast schedule. Pause. Distribution. Reassess the catalog. On paper, everything made sense. The brand needed protection. The audience deserved respect. Advertising partners required consistency. But for those who had once heard the anecdote about a different version that once existed, the feeling was like watching the same reel be cut twice. Once for tone, the second time for cultural context. In both instances, viewers never knew what they had lost, only that the space left behind seemed to grow larger. From there, the episode containing the softened confrontation took on a strange second life. The life of a television secret. It doesn't appear in streaming catalogs, isn't scheduled for reruns, isn't referenced in tribute compilations. But every time social media revives collective memory, Every time a rehearsal clip resurfaces online, the story returns with the same old, undiminished question: what exactly did they cut? That question doesn't just hunt for a missing scene. It chases a version of a character who once had a shot at growing in a less safe way. That echo even shifted how viewers interpreted The Cosby Show in retrospect. Once aware that certain edits were made to preserve image, the audience began reading between the lines. Why did the camera linger longer on the father's smile here? Why did the laugh track enter half a beat early over there, masking an awkward silence? Not everyone found the answers, but the urge to ask grew stronger. And that is the long-term impact of what seemed like a harmless censorship choice. It reshaped how people consumed the show. Viewers went from watching for comfort to scanning for clues, from trusting in a warm tone to probing for shadows on the frame's edge. For Warner, the consequences were even more complex. On one hand, his disciplined silence, saying little about the past, focusing on his own projects and performances, allowed him to step out from under the label of the Huxtable son and stand on his own artistic merit. On the other hand, the very scene that was cut kept reappearing in conversations over the years, as if the public wanted to return to him a privilege to give Theo the voice he never got to raise on air. The paradox was painful. What Warner wanted to leave behind, a seemingly small scene, had become the anchor pulling his name back into a larger dialogue on power and control in Hollywood. He never asked to become a symbol, but the echo of the cut scene placed him at the center of a discourse he always approached carefully, that of young artists and the tonal ceiling. Within the fan community, the story escalated in the way digital culture knows best. Timelines were built to trace that date that month against airing schedules. Leaked script pages, rehearsal transcripts, blurry behind-the-scenes photos all stitched together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The full picture may never emerge, but the effort to reconstruct it has already turned the episode into legend. Every missing piece is evocative, just imagining Theo pushing the question a little further. Cliff faltering for half a second is enough to spark the viewer's imagination. And once imagination joins the chase, no archive can ever fully erase it. The long-term impact also lies in how networks now speak. Phrases like potential impact on character integrity, cold, vague, but effective, have become the misty veil behind which countless content decisions are made in an age of heightened sensitivity. People no longer say cut, but coordinate, not delete, but optimize the catalog. And it's precisely this layer of vocabulary that fuels the public's desire to dig backward. If everything is merely repositioned, then what was moved instead of faced head-on. Warner's career and the choice of silence. Leaving the Huxtable household behind, Warner chose to reconstruct his career like a skilled craftsman, dismantling each Theo, labeled piece, and replacing it with new materials that carried fewer associations. He avoided roles like the wise sitcom dad characters that might remind audiences of Cliff through the eyes of the son he once played, and instead took the harder route, venturing into the darker territory of crime dramas, experimenting with the slow rhythm of independent films, committing patiently to voiceover studios, and quietly nurturing creative veins in music and poetry. It wasn't a loud pivot, but a series of subtle adjustments, toning down the brightness, adding a few deeper notes, changing the angle. So the familiar face appeared under a different light. This strategy operated on a minimalist yet demanding principle. Say little and stay consistent. Warner rarely issued bold denouncements of the past. He simply made present-day choices. Each new project was like a brick laid along the straight path he'd mapped, not reinforcing an old legend, nor recklessly tearing down collective memory. To the public, this appeared as silence. To the craft, it was focus. On the roll, on the character's breath, on a frame unclouded by the noise of backstage drama. When real-life storms hit, Warner kept his rhythm. He didn't suddenly become a spokesperson, nor did he appoint himself prosecutor or defense attorney in the media. Rather than stepping into the storm to shout his stance, he chose to stand one beat apart, acknowledging the sadness of seeing a legacy tarnished, but refusing to become a mouthpiece for any side. His interviews, therefore, were conducted like rituals. Sparse, brief, precise, just enough for the public to hear the artist's heartbeat, but never enough to pull him into an endless battle. Warner's silence is not empty. It has structure. On its deepest level lies a respect for the past, for the days when the whole crew gave their all to create a family universe. that made millions of viewers feel a little kinder after each episode. On a nearer layer lies professional self-preservation. He knows the media storm can devour any current accomplishment and reduce an artist to the shadow of the question, whose side are you on? Keeping distance is his way of shielding creative labor from being defined by an unwinnable argument. And closest to the surface is private life, family, friends, promised projects, all of which require the peace that a fiery statement could steal overnight. On screen, Warner's choices are visible in his preference for challenge characters, with moral ambiguity situations, with no easy resolution stories that end without a warm hug. This is how he severs the unconscious link between himself and the heartwarming lesson of years past. While also proving a talent, the cutscene once hinted at the ability to stand strong when a narrative enters more sensitive terrain. In the voiceover booth, he learned to tell stories without Theo's face to assist him. On music and poetry stages, he found his own rhythm, measured, restrained, full of silence, as if practicing a language designed to resist noise. The maturity of Warner's silent choices also shows in how he draws boundaries with commercial nostalgia. He avoids reunion offers, meant only to stir memory declines, cameos that serve as callbacks, and is cautious with projects that risk turning the past into a prop. He doesn't reject the legacy, but he refuses to let it be the only yardstick. He understands the value of a glorious era, but understands even more the cost of letting the past dictate the future. In the end, what Warner has preserved is his stance. Not bitter, not romanticized, not emotionally manipulative with complaints or hyperbole. He simply continues steadily along the axis he has chosen. If in the past, a confrontation scene was softened to maintain the tone of a universe, then today Warner's career is built in another tone, quiet, steady, sparing in words. And in that tone, silence is not absence. It is glue connecting his roles, his projects, and his true self into a coherent form, far enough from the noise to breathe close enough to the audience to be heard when it truly matters. The cutscene resurfaces. After Warner's death. It wasn't until Warner passed away, the news just released, that the internet began to murmur. Amid tributes and warm behind-the-scenes photos, a grainy clip surfaced, muted sound rustling pages. A table read, "Rehearsal." Theo facing Cliff. His voice no longer hesitant. It wasn't the familiar "I messed up, Dad" tone. It was a string of pointed questions about household standards, authority, and fairness. The simulated laugh track fell silent. At one moment, Cliff paused half a beat before responding, a hesitation the aired version had never allowed. That alone was enough to spark a wildfire. Timelines lit up with questions like, why was this buried? And who might Theo have become if this had aired? What made the clip more striking was how it told its own story. No watermark, no studio logo, just script pages laid on the table, pencil notes in the margins, tempo change marks in red. The rough tape quality made it feel more authentic to the digital-savvy viewer, unpolished, unedited. Users began dissecting the frame, a low-angle shot capturing Warner as he raised his voice, a diagonal cut, locking on Cliff when the question struck a nerve. Some even stripped the audio just to hear the silence between characters, the silence that had previously always been smoothed over with a quip or a perfectly timed laugh. That silence now raised a new feeling. The Cosby Show could have gone further, it just didn't. Critics quickly joined in placing the clip within the power structures of its time. This wasn't just a strong moment for a young actor. It was proof that a show's tone could serve as a tool of control, not only protecting the image of a central figure, but also compressing the emotional growth of supporting characters. Here, the standard wasn't good, bad, but permitted, not permitted. By that measure, Warner as Theo had once touched a potential for maturity, daring to ask, daring to follow conflict to its end. But that potential was folded away in favor of a safer structure. The clip then became a symbol of the aesthetic boundary erected by production power. Among fans, the effect was stranger still. They began to see Theo not as the lovable kid who learned a lesson each episode, but as a character restrained by the tone of his universe. A flurry of posts compared aired episodes where Theo neared a difficult question only for the narrative to pivot toward a laugh line. Placed alongside the leaked clip, these earlier moments began to look like toned-down drafts. From that point, Warner was reinterpreted as a deep actor, not just skilled at delivering charm within sitcom rhythm, but able to sustain tension without breaking character. That lens felt like a restoration, a return of a slice that broadcast history had once taken away. Articles, podcasts, and video essays formed a new thread of collective memory. From the rehearsal clip to the Huxtable legacy, to the disciplined silence Warner had kept for years. Podcast hosts invited 80s and 90s sitcom writers and directors to unpack tone, how it saved a show, and how it quietly erased moments of character growth. Some cultural critics referred to the grammar of smoothness, how mainstream television polished conflict into healing moments, while pushing sensitive questions out of frame. At the center of all these associations, Warner emerged as a paradoxical figure. The quieter he had been, the more he was remembered. The more he distanced himself from nostalgia, the more nostalgia pulled him back. Doubts weren't absent. Some questioned the clip's authenticity. Was it from another episode? Was the dialogue edited together? But it was precisely the uncertainty that gave the clip its power. It pushed viewers not just to verify facts, but to confront their own feelings. And the feeling was clear: another Theo had once existed, if not on screen, then within the creative intent of the cast in the memory of the room. That existence, however fragile, was enough to make it impossible to watch The Cosby Show the same way again. Every joke, every warm lesson was now held up against a new hypothetical. If the heat hadn't been lowered, where might the story have gone? From a television history perspective, the clip exposed a fracture between two values: safety and growth. The Cosby Show consistently chose the former. That's why it became a legend. But the clip left people mourning the latter, an expansion pack that never came. And now that Warner is gone, that regret has effaced the face of an actor, once calm enough not to demand the scene back, but now reclaimed at least in interpretation by the very audience he never tried to sway. In the end, the cut episode isn't just a backstage footnote. It's a mirror reflecting how power shapes stories, how laughter can mask silence, and how an artist chooses to walk through noise with calm resolve. It compels us to rewatch The Cosby Show, not only as a warm-hearted legend, but as a text with erased lines where a sharper Theo once knocked on the door, and a grown Warner chose silence in order to keep creating. If this story resonates with you, feel free to share your thoughts. What moment of Theo's do you remember most? And what do you think might have happened if that confrontation scene had aired? Don't hesitate to leave a comment. Suggest more sources or pass this along to a friend who also grew up with the Huxtables. Who knows, maybe our conversation is the very way to restore the lines that were once erased from the screen.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.